Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're happy to have you with us tonight. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library. And just a note, we are recording this event. I think you probably heard that as you joined. It's December. Happy December. It's lovely to have you all with us. And I think we can get started. First of all, I'd like to thank our Excellent Friends group for their support of this program, this program and the whole series of programs, and many of the programs that the library puts on for adults. It's an excellent group, and we couldn't do much of the work that we do without them. And it is my very great pleasure tonight to welcome Jane Oneail of Culturally Curious back to the library for this is the 7th time. Jane, did you remember that?
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this program and have missed any of the others, you can see them on our website or on our YouTube channel. You'll see that link in the chat. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the program. And I think let's get started. So as I said, we have Jane Oneail with us tonight. Jane holds a master's in art history from BU and a master's in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. She's taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. She'll be speaking tonight about a family of artists very close to my heart, the Wyeth family of NC, Andrew, and Jamie. And without further ado, welcome, Jane.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you for the invitation back to the Maynard Public Library. I'm so glad we can continue doing these programs. So thank you for everybody for joining us tonight. We should be having a lot of fun over the next hour looking at these incredible artists from this really remarkable family. We will, of course, be getting to this image that's on the screen tonight, the most famous Wyeth painting, perhaps. But I wanted to get started by giving you a little bit of a lay of the land for how we'll move through the material tonight. What we're going to start off with is a quick introduction to the family in general, and then zero in on NC Wyeth, our patriarch, a brief introduction to the next generation, his 5 children, and then zero in once again on his youngest, Andrew Wyeth, and then Andrew Wyeth's youngest, Jamie Wyeth. So we're going to be looking at the family tree a few times just so everybody is oriented with how everybody's related. But here we have the 3 major artists. We have NC, the patriarch, with his son Andrew, and then Andrew as an older gentleman with his son Jamie over here. All right, so let's dive right in here. I mentioned family trees before. All right, so here is NC Wyeth with his wife Carolyn and their 5 children, and we get a sense of who they are from the family tree here. I think it's important to know that having a family and sort of raising a family was always really important to NC Wyeth. It was something that struck him as profoundly important while he was a young man studying art. He saw his own teacher, who had his own large family, picnicking with his wife and children under a tree one day. And NC Wyeth actually wrote home to his mother about how he aspired to have the same kind of family life. And we'll see that that becomes a major preoccupation in his life as we go through the material today. So NC Wyeth, let's turn our attention to him, Newell Converse Wyeth. He's generally thought of as one of the country's greatest illustrators. He's right up there with Norman Rockwell. And I must confess, I know Norman Rockwell a lot better, but it's been such a pleasure getting to know NC Wyeth preparing for this program. And I realized that people's general conceptions of NC Wyeth absolutely influence their thinking about Norman Rockwell. So here he is as a young man. We have N.C. Wyeth. He was born in 1882 and he died in 1945, just before his 63rd birthday. He grew up outside of Boston in Needham, Massachusetts, and he had a great education, great preparation for a career in the arts. He went to what is now the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and it was there that he had a professor that recommended he go into illustration. So in 1902, when he was about 24, 25 years old, N.C. Wyeth went down to the Brandywine River Valley in southeastern Pennsylvania to study illustration with essentially the country's best illustrator at the time, a man by the name of Howard Pyle. So Wyeth had gotten access or admission to Pyle's classes, which he was running for free for very few select students. And so I think N.C. Wyeth was kind of riding high off of being selected for Howard Pyle's school. And at that young age, he actually submitted an illustration for consideration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. So here, of course, we're looking at young N.C. Wyeth with his palette and a canvas just behind him. He looks like he's got a lot of confidence here. And so he submits this image that we see over here on the right, which is called the Bronco Buster. And of course, it was selected for the cover. And I can't emphasize enough what a big deal this was. There were artists that tried their entire careers to get on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And N.C. Wyeth gets it his first shot, and he's only in his mid-20s. And he was really proud of the subject matter here. He called it, a distinctly American subject. And of course, it has a lot of action. I think it's sort of lost on us in our modern day eyes and sort of thinking about how accustomed we are to seeing action on TV and in movies. But this was an action shot for the early 20th century, seeing this horse bucking up in the air with the rider and his crop up in the air as well. I want to show you what N.C. Wyeth submitted to the Saturday Evening Post, because it's a little bit different. And I think it says a lot about N.C. Wyeth, and we'll see how it potentially influences his children as well. One element of this picture that was not included on the cover, because you could see it would sort of mucky up the masthead over here, was that the rider's hat was flying off. And I just love this detail of how it just sort of grazes the edge of the painting here. It creates this really unusual tension that I don't often see in other 20th century art, or in illustration even, for that matter. It's an unusual detail that I love, I appreciate, and I think we'll see a little bit more of this as we move through tonight's program. So he was so successful with this early attempt at being a cover illustrator that the Saturday Evening Post actually invested in him. He got enough money to travel to the Southwest and sort of observe cowboys in their natural state. He could sort of play at being a cowboy himself. So here we see him on the back of a horse. Here he's in a studio setting with a cowboy as a model. And so he's kind of immersing himself in this subject matter, and it's going pretty well for him. He gets a few more covers of the Saturday Evening Post. This one's in 1907. I think this is a really interesting cover, because at this point, we're seeing an image of an American cowboy that is, still very masculine, but a little bit withdrawn, a little bit forlorn here. He is set against this huge blazing orange setting sun in this kind of dramatic profile here with, the wide brimmed hat sweeping up and the mustache and the handkerchief sweeping down. And I think it's really interesting that just a couple decades later, Norman Rockwell takes almost that same cowboy and makes him a comedic figure, a figure of the past. So what N.C. Wyeth has created is almost a nostalgic figure becomes ridiculous in Norman Rockwell's eyes. The hat's bigger, the mustache is bigger, the handkerchief is bigger, and here he is listening to old tunes, remembering just how tough he used to be. So despite this, N.C. Wyeth continues on with outdoor subjects and with themes from the American West. and he's credited with creating a lot of really sort of sensitive and beautifully created images of Native Americans. There's been a lot of scholarly interest in these images because these are really the only non-white people that N.C. Wyeth ever created. And here he is thought to be, you know, this great illustrator of American life. But I think the general consensus is that Native Americans were so few and far between at this point that they were considered kind of another, like that cowboy, kind of a reference to a nostalgic past. But these are simply gorgeous images. Of course, another cover from the Saturday Evening Post, and this image over here on the left is called Into the Crystal Depths. It's really just a gorgeous image. I love how this water is flowing out towards us here. So N.C. Wyeth has kind of carved out a niche for himself, even beyond the Saturday Evening Post. And by 1907, Outing magazine has referred to him as one of our greatest, if not our greatest, painter of American outdoor life. So this is a painting that he created as an illustration for a Western novel the same year, 1907. And it's called The Little Posse Started Out on Its Way. So a bunch of tough guys on horses, you know, and the action is about to unfold. N.C. Wyeth, we'll see, has a great sort of keen sense about action, and this particularly serves him well as he begins to illustrate popular books. So, so many of us are probably familiar with N.C. Wyeth because he illustrated so many books. I believe it was 112 to be exact. And 25 of those books were for Scribner's, the Scribner's Classics. And the first one he did was Treasure Island. He created 17, as you can see over here, full-size paintings that were then reproduced with reprinting of Treasure Island, which was originally printed in 1883. N.C. Wyeth created these images in 1911. So, so let's take a look at sort of what these images were like and how they might have influenced the millions of readers that looked at them as they were reading these books. So I should mention over here we've got a few pirates on the cover, and N.C. Wyeth's pirates have, without question, influenced our modern notion of Pirates of the Caribbean. Johnny Depp owes a huge debt of gratitude to N.C. Wyeth. All right, so here are a few of these really dramatic illustrations that he created for Treasure Island. Over here, this is called One More Step, Mr. Hands, where our protagonist, Jim Hawkins, is up on the mast of this ship, and he's about to shoot a pirate who's coming towards him. This is all dramatic diagonals, these sort of extreme angles, and just the phrase there that is being illustrated shows that, you know, it's a life or death moment. Over here we see our protagonist Jim Hawkins has been taken hostage by Long John Silver. Again, this kind of classic notion of a modern day pirate. Our modern sensibility of a pirate is probably better stating it. So one of the incredible things that N.C. Wyeth does with this text is his illustrations help us to expand upon the written word. So this is an illustration that he created for the simple line of, "I said goodbye to my mother and the cove." This is when Jim Hawkins is leaving home and about to set sail. But N.C. Wyeth's image is not about simply saying goodbye. It's about what his mother is feeling here. It's about the sense of adventure that this young man feels as he's walking away from his mother. There's so much added here beyond that simple line of text. You know, the old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And certainly N.C. Wyeth was adding that and more to all of these classic texts that he was illustrating. Now, here is the remarkable thing. a young artist. Here he is. He's in his 20s, but he's not yet 30 years old. Those 17 paintings that he created for Treasure Island that helped him buy this home in Chadsford, Pennsylvania, which sat on 18 acres of land. And from there, he was also able to build a studio just up the hill from it. So he's doing pretty well. And this home was where he raised his 5 children. So I would say he's remarkably successful for being an artist and for being so young. So here's just an interior view of that home studio. It's an enormous space because he was also taking on enormous commissions, and it's just absolutely light filled. And here you can still see some of the objects that he would use as props within his paintings. It's pretty wonderful to see. So he continues to illustrate books, as I said, 112 in total. Over here on the right, we see an illustration for the boys King Arthur, and that's on the left, and on the right is Last of the Mohicans. And once again, I want to emphasize just how dramatic these images are over here. This fight over here on the edge of the cliff looks like they are about to fall off at any second into this waterfall. The boys King Arthur is a moment of jousting, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but my husband is actually a jouster. Before I met him, he was on a reality show called Full Metal Jousting. And one of the biggest problems that they had with the show is that jousts happen so fast, the naked eye can't really even make sense out of what you just saw. It's sort of like hockey with the puck moving too fast. So they'd have to slow down the camera and show everything in slow motion. And somehow N.C. Wyeth was able to do that with his picture. He knew exactly what moment to freeze for us and in order to convey all of this incredible drama in his picture. Now, everything wasn't just about action for him. He could create these images that still, the word that I always reach for is cinematic in quality. They're really striking images. This is another image from the boys King Arthur just before, it's the moment that King Arthur is given the Excalibur. So we have this disembodied arm reaching out of the water. We have King Arthur in this beautifully carved boat with Merlin hooded behind him, and everything seems still, but there are these swans flying past them, and there's no sense of space beyond it. It's like this misty environment. It's absolutely gorgeous. And you can imagine every child that was reading these books just ruminated over these images. They're so powerful. But N.C. Wyeth was not really fully fulfilled by creating images like this. He longed to be a fine art artist as opposed to somebody who is creating images inspired by text. So every now and then he would sort of dabble, I should say, in the fine arts. This is a painting that he created in 1920 called Buttonwood Farm. And it's sort of in an American Impressionist style. We've got this really light palette here, broken visible brush strokes all around, this beautiful attention to these, I think these are sycamore trees. And this would have been a farm that was right near him where he had settled in Chadsford, Pennsylvania. So a familiar spot to him. And when paintings like this were exhibited, they were usually pretty well received, but where he was making money was really back at illustration. One other, I think, really incredible sort of painting / illustration that he did was this one called The Giant from 1923. And it speaks to so many aspects of his life. It speaks to his talent for creating narrative in his pictures, and also his passion for his family. He created this specific work in honor of one of his students who had passed away probably before the age of 30 from tuberculosis. But he and this student were very like-minded and also kind of shared this love of their families. So in the foreground, N.C. Wyeth has painted all of these children playing on a beach, and they're looking up at the sky at this incredible shared vision of this huge giant sort of clomping past them. He's ethereal, he's sort of made up of the clouds, but separate from it at the same time. And it really speaks to that magic of imaginative play. Now, if you're counting how many kids are down here, there is 5 plus 1. The 5 from the standing girl over to the right represent N.C. Wyeth's children, and then the 6th one over here represents that young man, the student that had died. So it's sort of sharing that kinship, that same sensibility that they both had in this picture here by including him in the foreground. All right, so like I said, N.C. Wyeth had kind of grander plans for his artistic career, and you can see that in the decision that he made around a Maine summer home that he purchased in 1920. So he's doing well enough that they can afford a summer home in Maine. But what does he decide to name this beautiful house that he has purchased right on the water? He calls it 8 Bells, and he names it after a painting by the very famous, very beloved, and very well regarded American artist Winslow Homer, who also spent a great deal of his time on the Maine coast and created these really dramatic pictures about man versus nature, these anonymous figures on the water, sort of battling sea and sky. Over here, N.C. Wyeth's picture of his house doesn't seem to capture any of that, but just the fact that he named his house in honor of Winslow Homer's painting shows that there's a real admiration there. The Maine coast becomes a favorite subject matter for N.C. Wyeth, and I think you can particularly see that here in this picture from 1939. He worked on this over several years, and this is called Island Funeral. There's a lot going on here. So we are looking at this little island from a bird's eye view. We're hovering up above it like a bird, and we can see all of these different boats that are just jam-packed with figures that are coming to the shoreline here and sort of pulling up on the sand and then heading in towards this little house where we can imagine that this funeral is taking place. There is something slightly cartoonish to the way that this has been painted. It's not really a view, well, it's certainly not a view that any of us would have without hovering above the earth this way. So my thinking here is that N.C. Wyeth was familiar with what else was happening in American art in the 1930s. And what was happening, or what was being celebrated really, was what was called regionalism. Think Grant Wood, American Gothic. And this is an example of Grant Wood's paintings. He was one of several Midwestern painters who were painting these farm scenes that have this slightly cartoonish quality to them. A lot of bird's eye views like this, with like this gently swelling landscape, these sort of stylized trees over here. And I think you get a similar effect with Island Funeral over here on the right from N.C. Wyeth. So maybe he's kind of experimenting in what was the popular style of the day, adopting it from the Midwest to the Maine coast. And so here we see the artist and the painting just behind him. Now, what's sort of tragic here is that Island Funeral was included in part of a one-man exhibition at a gallery in New York City called the Macbeth Gallery, and N.C. Wyeth only sold 2 works from the entire exhibition. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds fine. He sold some works. But at this point in N.C. Wyeth's career, his son Andrew had already sold out several shows at the same gallery. So I think that probably had a little bit of a sting to it. So let's turn our attention to what N.C. Wyeth was doing in the next few years. This is his painting called The Lobstermen, and this is from 1944, and this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we can sort of think of this as like one of the best examples of who N.C. Wyeth was as a fine art artist. So what are our impressions of this work of art? What is going on here? I would say, well, I mean, the first thing that I notice is it's very somber colors. It's almost monochromatic. There's a lot of grays and beiges here. It's still got this kind of regionalist flair to me, but because there's something seemingly like heroic and celebratory about this solitary figure who is kind of pushing and pulling these oars to move across this choppy water. We don't really see him as a lobsterman, but as this American, this really strong figure. And I think he's trying to channel a little bit of Winslow Homer with an image like this. Winslow Homer, again, was the celebrated Maine artist who was working, several generations before N.C. Wyeth. And these were the types of images that Winslow Homer was creating. These anonymous figures who are laboring against the ocean. Notice this figure who's leaning over the edge of this little dory to pull in this herring net. The weather looks ambiguous. Their whole situation looks very precarious, as opposed to this hero, singular figure in the boat over here. So I would say that this has a stronger relationship to what those regionalist artists were doing. Artists like Grant Wood, the artist represented over here on the left is named Thomas Hart Benton, and this picture was commissioned by the Navy. It was part of a big series commissioned by the Navy the same year that the Lobstermen was created. And I can almost imagine N.C. Wyeth thinking, why can't I get a great big commission from the Navy? But notice how you have this figure in the center who looks like he's sort of striding forward. Thomas Hart Benton always created these kind of figures with these undulating bodies, but I get that same sense of movement and strength over here in his painting, The Lobstermen. So we see he's trying to do something a little bit different, trying to tap into maybe what was popular in the day, but maybe coming up a little bit short of what Winslow Homer was accomplishing at this time. So in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, he's called back to illustration for an important purpose, and that is to support the war effort. And I think this kind of brings his illustration talents to their best possible use, because in a poster like this, you can imagine, you can go back to like the boys King Arthur and Last of the Mohicans, and you can imagine those battle scenes, and he's playing it out for us in the air and on land down here, this dramatic Uncle Sam pointing off into the distance with a globe covered with the American flag. There's so much going on here to sort of summon some patriotic feelings here. So this is from 1942, and doesn't it make you want to buy some war bonds? Now, just to give you a sense in terms of what N.C. Wyeth looked like in 1942, where he was in his life, he is almost 63 years old at the time that the war is ending. This is a self-portrait from just a few years earlier. Now, N.C. Wyeth's death is sort of the stuff of legend, and it's really tragic. His life comes to a really abrupt ending, and it is tied into these kind of strange images that you see over here on the right. He had a regular schedule of often picking up his grandson, who was named for him, and going out and doing chores with him. And one day, his car with his grandson in it stalled on some train tracks that ran through town. And the train just happened to be coming through at that very moment. And the car was struck, and he and his grandson were killed. It's almost too awful to imagine. But there's a lot of speculation that went along with it, and none of it's proven, but I think some of it provides some interesting insight into some of his work and perhaps even some of his son's work. So I'm just going to share a little bit of it. And again, it's just speculation, and some of it might even be idle gossip. So there was speculation out there that perhaps his car didn't stall. There were witnesses that said that they heard the train make several, the whistle make several blasts before it actually hit the car. And this was the one time a train only went across these tracks at one time every single day. So they might have heard it, and he might have purposely parked there, or maybe even planned for it. The other thing that was talked about when he died was that perhaps he was having a relationship with his daughter-in-law, the mother of that grandson. Perhaps even the grandson might have been his son and not his grandson. So there was a lot of chatter, but certainly a tragic death in any event. And to wrap up on N.C. Wyeth, I want to emphasize again how important family was to him. This was a huge mural that he did back in the 1930s that was called what was it? It was called The Apotheosis of the Family. This was for a savings bank, and it was 60 feet long and about 17 feet high. So it's about the culmination of family life. And if you have really good eyes here, you can probably see that the family at the center is essentially his family. It's a father, a wife, and 5 kids. There's a babe in her arms, and everything else in the world kind of comes from well, life starts with that family, and then it sort of allows and enables everything else in the world to happen. Here is a picture of N.C. Wyeth. I apologize, it's a little bit grainy, but just to give you a sense of the scale of this project too, he's at the top of these stairs over here, and another family picture as well. So, so his family, training his family, guiding his family was really important to him throughout his life. So let's turn our attention to the second generation. He had these 5 kids. What was his impact on each of them? We'll move through this kind of quickly so we can get to Andrew Wyeth. All right, so the second generation. We're going to begin with Henrietta Wyeth. It's pretty remarkable how many of his children become well, they're all creative in their own right. A lot of them become artists in their own right. So Henrietta Wyeth becomes an artist. She had a hand that was disabled from polio, but she still studied under her father. She married another artist, Peter Hurd, and she was the only one to leave the Chadsford area, really. She moved to the Southwest. And just to give you a sense in terms of her capabilities, she painted this portrait of Patricia Nixon, Pat Nixon, that is in the collection of the White House. If I hadn't told you that this was Henrietta Wyeth, you could have easily thought, well, is this John Singer Sargent? It's a really elegant picture of Pat Nixon. And you can see that Henrietta Wyeth had incredible capabilities. And I think in the years ahead, we'll probably see a lot more art historians and many more books published on N.C. Wyeth's daughters. His next daughter was Carolyn, and she had an 11-year marriage, but for the most part, she was like the daughter that stayed home, and she was very closely connected with N.C. Wyeth and that homestead. She kind of took on the mantle of being the teacher in her father's footsteps. He trained her, and then she helped to train all of his subsequent students. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of works that she was producing, here is her painting that was called Up from the Woods from 1974. And at the top, of course, you can just see the edge of that house in Chadsford, Pennsylvania that she shared with her parents. The next child in line was Nathaniel, and he was actually originally named N.C. Wyeth, and he was really the only son that didn't have a traditionally creative career. And so I wasn't even going to focus on him that much, but when I found out that N.C. Wyeth legally changed his son's name from N.C. Wyeth to Nathaniel, I thought there's got to be a story there. So it turns out Nathaniel had just different abilities. And when he was a baby, they used to put him out in a stroller in a sun porch and let him nap out there. And whenever he woke up from his naps, he had oily hands. And apparently he was just wheeling himself around in his stroller before he would fall asleep. And so N.C. Wyeth said, I'm not going to burden this baby with the name of an artist. He is an engineer. So he legally changed his son's name to Nathaniel in honor of an engineer in the family. Nathaniel went on to work for DuPont, and he had, I think, at least a dozen different patents to his name, and he actually invented the plastic soda bottle. So, which is why we have this illustration over here of like the father with the paintbrush head and the son with the bow tie and the plastic soda bottle head happening over here. I wish I knew the name of the illustrator. He wasn't credited in the article that I looked up. So NC Wyeth actually said, you know, everything that my son Nathaniel is doing is also really creative work, and he is essentially just one of us working in a different vein. The next in line here was Anne Wyeth, and she was the musical member of the family. When she was young, she played piano, and when she got a little bit older, she began to compose music. And just to give you a sense in terms of how impressive her compositions were and how impressive the whole family was, several of her pieces were played when her siblings and family members had receptions at the White House. So this family had some pretty impressive connections. And then finally, we get to the baby, Andrew Wyeth. All right, so let's turn our attention to him. And here are some pictures of him as a young man. He was, of course, really striking and of course, very capable as a young man. So like his siblings, he learned at his father's knee. And he was sort of sickly as a child, so he got this kind of special attention. I believe they pulled him out of traditional schooling pretty early on. And by the time he was a teenager, he was finishing and executing some of his father's paintings for him. And he had the incredible benefit of being the son to a really highly regarded artist. So, so there were connections made and that sort of thing. But Andrew Wyeth was always trying to kind of forge his own way, a separate identity from what his father was doing. And he was not really interested in illustration. So instead of doing the oil paintings that his father was doing, he strikes off at an early age in watercolor. And he does impressive work at a very young age in watercolor. So these are from when he's about 20 years old. The colors are gorgeous. His capability with this medium that I find so fickle and so unpredictable. I mean, you have to be comfortable with color and water just kind of bleeding when it comes to watercolor. You can see that there's that there's a real ease and mastery of this very fickle medium over here. So when he was just 20 years old, he had his first show at the Macbeth Gallery in New York City, and these watercolor paintings all sold out. Who wouldn't want one of these, right? They're just gorgeous. And this painting over here is actually also called the Lobstermen, just like his father's painting that we saw before. The son's painting came first, but I think it's a really interesting comparison because you can see that even at a young age, Andrew Wyeth is creating much more complicated compositions. Look at how the water sort of folds in on itself in these crisscrosses in the foreground, and how he has created this moment that is very ambiguous. We don't know exactly what this figure in the boat is doing. He's a lobsterman, so I imagine he's pulling up, cages with lobsters in them. But it's not a heroic, it's not a celebratory moment. It doesn't feel like Uncle Sam with the flag and the globe and that sort of thing, as compared to a pretty straightforward portrayal that we see from NC Wyeth just a few years later. So Andrew Wyeth has a really different sensibility, and it serves him well throughout his career. So here's a self-portrait from Andrew Wyeth from 1945. Another way he tries to sort of strike out from underneath his father's wing is not just with watercolor, but also with tempera paint. And that's what we see here. Tempera paint dries very matte. So oil paint tends to have this kind of shiny finish to it. And tempera paint looks like it's all dried up, and he tends to use really sort of muted colors along with it. And this was something that his father just didn't have this same kind of capability with. So this was another way to separate himself and to define himself as an artist. So in this self-portrait, he's walking through a field, no doubt, right there in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, because all of this whole family stays so connected to Chadds Ford. He probably has his artist portfolio under his arm here. And we see this kind of wild grasses and that sort of thing that are growing up along the horizon line over here and in front of him. It's kind of this moody piece. But the thing that I love about it, the thing that always grabs my attention is this giant bird, maybe it's a hawk or a crow in the background, and just how it grazes the horizon line there. It reminds me of that hat from the Bronco Buster. It is an unusual detail. It does create this dramatic tension in the work. And I would say that this is something that he probably picked up on from his father. So it's the same year that his father passes away. And Andrew Wyeth has so much to grapple with the loss of his father. It's not just the loss of his father, it's the loss of his teacher, his mentor, the person that has brought him into this field, the person that has been sort of on the same wavelength with him for his entire life. And interestingly, it's right after his father dies that his personal style really crystallizes. So Andrew Wyeth pictures look like this picture from 1946 called Winter. And Andrew Wyeth stays close to home. So many of his images are right in Chadds Ford, right around that homestead that his father had purchased after painting the images for Treasure Island. So what we're looking at here is a piece of property from their neighbor's yard, a favorite subject for all of the Wyeths. And we see this figure who seems to be kind of running down this hill. His relationship to the landscape is a little ambiguous. He could also almost be seen as like falling. But we also see these car tracks over here too. And we could psychoanalyze a little bit thinking about Andrew Wyeth and the way his father died and the fact that it was in an automobile. And I tend to think of the fact that whenever he chooses to include car tracks, it's almost like a reference to his father. He said he always regretted not painting his father's portrait. He did talk about this picture as being like a portrait of his father because of the way this hill here stretches almost to that horizon line, playing that little game that they play with the edge of the picture frame. But he talked about that hill as being like his father's chest and how it would expand and collapse as he breathed. So there was a lot here that's connected to this family lineage. And so many of Andrew Wyeth's pictures that kind of sort of dance with realism, really. So this is another tempera painting from the next year. It's from 1947, and it's called Wind from the Sea. You look at this, again, it's these really muted colors. There's this somberness to it, an austerity to it. We see like the cracks in the window shade, the cracks in the wall, what seems like these beautiful lace curtains that seem to kind of unravel and fall apart at the edges here. There's so much about this picture that to me speaks to your kind of internal life, your emotional life, being kind of trapped inside, and what's outside are those car tracks again. And perhaps he was thinking about his father, or perhaps there were just car tracks in that view there. But we can see that he continues to use the landscape that he grew up in as a main source of inspiration. Now, we are probably all familiar with another source of inspiration for him, and that was Christina Olsen. This is a painting that he created of her from 1947. He was introduced to her and her brother by his future wife at the time, and he really actually fell in love with their farm. He loved the beautiful property that they lived on, and he kind of set up a studio there, and he would paint their property, and only kind of later became interested in them. So in this picture, I mean, it's this gorgeous figure here sitting in profile. We don't know much about her, but look at the way he's painted that door. The door is kind of a knockout here too. It looks like this old weather-beaten door. You get so much detail here, even though there is this kind of looseness in the way that he has painted the entire picture. So once again, his technical capability here is just really astounding. So a few years after kind of setting up shop at the Olsen's farm, he becomes really interested in painting Anna Christina or Christina Olsen, which brings us to one of the most popular paintings of the 20th century, Christina's World, which was painted in 1948, and it hangs at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Apparently, the guards at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City say that their two most frequently asked questions are A, where is the bathroom? And B, where is Christina's World? People love this one. And that really says something because you've got, like, you know, Starry, Starry Night at MoMA. So there's something about this picture that is really captivating. We see this woman who is kind of lounging. She's not quite sitting. She's kind of propping herself up with these very, very skinny arms. And she's leaning towards these buildings that we see in the distance. Look at the little game he's playing with the edge of the picture frame here too, and that relationship with the top of that 18th century farmhouse that Christina Olsen lived in. We get this sense that there is something happening here. We get the sense that there's almost like an emergency unfolding, that she is looking at this property because she needs to get there, or she knows that something's happening there. There's a sense of urgency. So, so we're kind of immediately pulled into this. But then if you've read a little bit about this picture, or learned a little bit about it along the way, you might have known that Christina Olsen, the woman who lived here, the subject of the painting, was somebody who had essentially a muscle disorder where her muscles were atrophying. For a long time, they thought it was polio. But essentially, she did not have use of her legs. And instead of using a wheelchair, Christina opted to pull herself around her property and inside her house using her arms. So this was a moment not of somebody who was stranded in this field. This is a moment of mobility, actually, for Christina Olsen. But we do get this unusual sense of paralysis as we look at this incredible picture. So, so a few things to note. This is 1948, and this actually seems like a really backwards way of painting when you think about the art world at this time. Jackson Pollock was already creating drip paintings. You can imagine what the New York City art world thought of Andrew Wyeth in creating a painting that looked like this. You know, rural America, it doesn't really seem that revolutionary. Andrew Wyeth said that his paintings were abstract in many ways. If you just look at the way he painted this field, it is largely an abstract painting in so many ways. But he also talked about how he called this picture kind of a flat tire when he first painted it. And it was only later when he added this pink to her dress that he said it blew him across the room. And he realized that he had kind of landed on something really special with this image. And he and Christina Olsen forged this really special relationship. In fact, he said that when he died, he wanted to be buried right by Christina Olsen. And in fact, he was. You can go to this house today, to the Olson House. You can see on Instagram a lot of people recreate this image with varying degrees of success. So this farmhouse is now a national landmark. It is, I believe, the only national historic landmark that became so because it was the subject of a painting. Now, this is operated by the Farnsworth Museum, which has sort of staked its claim on Wyeth tourism. So they know that people will travel great distances to see an artist that they love. So in 1964, they purchased this work from Andrew Wyeth who was still very much alive. He had painted this picture just a year before. And at the time, they paid $65,000 for this painting. That was the highest price that a museum had ever paid a living artist for a work of art. This far surpassed what the Museum of Modern Art had paid for Christina's World, which I think was somewhere around $1,800. So he's doing pretty well at this point. This is called Her Room, and it's sort of like a portrait of his wife, where we can see, the pink curtains that she had sewed and her little systems of organizations with the shells in kind of descending order of size. It's just nice little references to who she was. But this same kind of muted colors, this kind of matte finish, is the sort of thing that we see in so many of his works that make his paintings so recognizable. I feel like you can't talk about Andrew Wyeth without showing this painting, The Master Bedroom, from 1965. I was talking with someone the other day who said that their daughter used to clean houses, and she said that there were so many houses that in their master bedroom had a reproduction of this work. There is something about this dog lying on the bed here that is very, very familiar and very endearing. He's captured something that really speaks to a lot of people here. But let's turn our attention to the greatest scandal of Andrew Wyeth's career, perhaps a manufactured scandal. So we are looking at the covers of Time and Newsweek magazine, which are both in 1986, are both featuring works by Andrew Wyeth. And up until this point, I mean, just think back to the days where you got all of your news from Time and Newsweek magazine, weekly magazines. And at this point in time, they had never featured the same subject, the same person on a work of art, unless it was like, or on the cover, I should say, unless it was like a president, a head of state. This was the very first time an artist had ever been featured on both covers. And it was because this huge treasure trove of Andrew Wyeth paintings had been uncovered, about 250 works in total, all featuring this stunning blonde named Helga. And when asked to comment on these paintings that had been secret for 15 years, his wife was not totally forthcoming, but somebody said, what are these paintings about, these Helga paintings? Because she was seen in various stages of undress. And Andrew Wyeth's wife sort of gulped and she said, well, they are about love. And then a scandal sort of erupts that Andrew Wyeth has been having an affair with this gorgeous woman named Helga. And many of these images are very beautiful, very sensual. We have The Daydream over here on the left and Lovers from 1981. And as it turned out, this entire collection, the 250 paintings, were all sold in one fell swoop as well. So that created another kind of sensation along with it. But the joke was sort of on the media. This became sort of a manufactured thing. As far as we know, there was no affair. In fact, Helga went on to kind of help take care of Andrew Wyeth in his older age. And a reporter asked if Helga was going to be present at his 90th birthday. He said, yeah, certainly. Oh, absolutely. She's part of the family now. I know it shocks everyone. That's what I love about it. It really shocks them. So apparently he just had a gorgeous model and he created some really gorgeous, sensual images of her. And his ability to capture the realism of this subject is just particularly stunning. This is a painting and a detail of the 1977 image called Braids. And so I just love the way he has portrayed her face here, the details of her sweater, certainly, every single stray hair that kind of flies out of those braids. It's all stunningly done here. Now, one of the last images that I wanted to share with you from Andrew Wyeth is just actually his last painting. It's from 2008 and it's called Goodbye. And it's right in keeping with his style, going back to the 1940s. It's these very sort of muted colors. It's this little bit of a dance that he plays with abstraction. And here, it still has this kind of somber quality to it. And you see this boat sailing off across the surface of the canvas. And it's as though it's Andrew Wyeth giving his own curtain call here. Interestingly enough, I almost feel like these look like tire tracks again in the water here. So Andrew Wyeth received so many awards during his lifetime. We can't even cover them all. Here he is receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom just a few years before his death. But he is really one of the most celebrated American artists of all time. Also, one of the most criticized too. I mean, if realism wasn't your thing, then you wouldn't be happy with an Andrew Wyeth. So before he died, or well, during his life, he was committed to painting depictions of his sons because he had never painted his father. So here's his painting of his son, Nicholas, and here's his painting of his youngest son, Jamie, in a picture called Far Away from 1952. So Jamie, of course, goes on to be an artist in his own right. Here's Andrew with his son, Jamie, in a great portrait over here. All right, so let's finish up by looking at Jamie Wyeth, who is a really spectacular artist in his own right. So in the photographs here, we see young Jamie Wyeth with his father. What's right up above their head? The portrait or the image called Her Room, the portrait of his mother. Here's his aunt, Carolyn, who was integral in his training. The real difference here now is that Jamie is the son of a highly regarded world-class fine art artist as opposed to an illustrator. And so he has connections in the art world that his father
first of all,
never enjoyed.
Fantastic presentation.
Let's just make sure we all have our microphones on mute right now, okay? So Jamie Wyeth, we can think of him as a prodigy. When he was just 17 years old, he painted this picture, which is called Portrait of Shorty. Shorty was essentially like a hermit that was living in the Chadds Ford area, and he talked him into sitting for a portrait. He has captured, every aspect of his kind of rough face here with the bags under his eyes and the pockets and folds of flesh and the 5 o'clock shadow on his chin over here. And he has set that against this really elegant damask silk chair with this dramatic kind of wing over here. Notice how the chair plays with the edge of the picture frame, just like his father's paintings of landscapes did. But clearly Jamie Wyeth has a real talent if he's creating works like this by 17. His father's connections get him connected to other major players in the art world. This is a portrait that he created just 2 years later at the age of 19 of a man named Lincoln Edward Kerstein. He was the founder of the New York City Ballet, the managing director for more than 40 years. He was a monuments man, if you're familiar with World War II and artworks that were stolen and protected during World War II. So he was an incredibly influential man. And here's Jamie Wyeth connected to him at the age of 19, creating this really sort of stunning and unusual portrait of him. And then just a few years after JFK's assassination, Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy get in touch with Jamie Wyeth at the age of 20 and ask him to paint JFK's official portrait. Can you imagine? And Jamie Wyeth actually says, I will paint a portrait, but it won't be the official portrait. And he spends the next few months traveling with Robert Kennedy, with Teddy Kennedy, studying their movements, studying their mannerisms, reviewing videos and photographs of JFK so that he felt like he could see him when he closed his eyes. And the resulting portrait is so powerful. And it really captures JFK, sort of warts and all. We've got this sense of the strabismus here with the one eye that kind of wanders to the side. But we've also got an image that honors him, that shows somebody who's like thoughtful, maybe deep in contemplation, maybe about to speak. His mind is engaged, even though his body sort of seems at rest here. The Museum of Fine Arts was very happy to purchase this portrait of hometown son, JFK, just a few years ago when they had a Jamie Wyeth retrospective. And Jamie Wyeth, because perhaps of his privilege, was given the opportunity really to have a quirky sense of humor, and that comes out in a lot of his paintings. He was asked to submit a self-portrait for entrance into the National Academy of Design. This is what he submitted. They said, no way, paint us something real. Apparently he would actually put a pumpkin on his head and wear it to family gatherings, like you can see in the photograph over here. Ultimately, he did paint a very nice self-portrait like the one that we see on the right and was accepted into the National Academy of Design. He gets married in 1968, and his wife Phyllis has some other sort of interesting connections that like weave threads back to his family story. His wife Phyllis was a lifelong equestrian, but she broke her neck in an automobile accident just a few years before she married Jamie Wyeth. So she had very limited mobility and would often use canes when she first met him, and later on wheelchairs. So it almost seems like this connection that his father had with Christina Olsen kind of filters down into the next generation. This is a painting that he created of his wife that's called "And Then Deep into the Gorge" from 1975. Art historians have interviewed her and him about it. He talks about how the horses are functioning like her legs. She talks about how she doesn't like that he made her shirt so low cut in this picture. So his quirky sense of humor comes out quite a bit in his selection of subjects. This is a man who could be painting like the rich and famous, and he chooses to paint pigs sometimes. Lots of animal pictures, really. This is from 1971. This is another animal picture that he created from 1975 called Islander, and this is, let me just, excuse me for one moment. I just have to make sure that my computer's plugged in okay, just a moment. All right, we should be good. I apologize for that. So here, this was like a sheep or a ram that he had to sort of gain the respect and trust of, who was living on this island and wanted to keep everyone off of it. And the way he's painted it is really remarkable. We see this incredible, the curling sort of fur or hair of this ram, and how it stands so majestically out on the edge of the cliffs of this island here. So Jamie Wyeth really knew that animal pictures were popular, and he painted his friend's dog, which was named Kleberg, several times. In this earlier picture from the early 1980s, he uses Kleberg, who has, Jamie Wyeth painted the circle around his eye here for basically comedic effect. He used mustache dye. In this case, he paints Kleberg next to this beehive, but he, in front of all of these books that his father and his grandfather had illustrated. Years later, he paints Kleberg in a picture called Squirreling. It's much more expressionistic, but we see like the real joy of this animal in this picture. And I can't help but think back to Master Bedroom, and anybody that's an animal lover sort of sees like the best of what you love in your pets in these two images. Now, Jamie Wyeth's sort of privilege and connections sort of all come together in the 1970s when he becomes connected to Andy Warhol, and the two of them become very interested in each other and decide to paint portraits of each other. And so the way this works out for them is that Jamie Wyeth creates this really stunning portrait of Andy Warhol. It's kind of a warts and all picture of Andy Warhol. It's stunning in its realism, particularly in the sense that Andy Warhol was so self-conscious about the way that he looked. This is kind of like an earlier sketch of it where we can see Andy from the side along with his dog, and the final image is frontal like this. But we've got, you know, the red nose here, this look of almost confusion on Andy Warhol's face, this kind of disheveled appearance here, which is so striking and so immediate. Jamie Wyeth really wins out in this partnership because Andy Warhol makes him look like a romantic hero in comparison. He silk screens him in the same style that he was using for, people like Mick Jagger at the time. So we're running very short on time, so we will finish up with a subject that all of the Wyeths really loved, and that was pumpkins. Seems kind of appropriate for, the end of the year like this. So we have NC over here, we have Andrew in the middle and Jamie over here. And you can see with this one same subject, they all handle it with like their individual sensibility. So NC Wyeth, there's like clarity in the depiction, the subject, maybe a narrative here. We've got a farmer who's harvesting, and he's, this is like noble work. With Andrew Wyeth, we have what is most likely a watercolor over here, perhaps a tempera painting, but there's this somberness to it. There's a mystery to it. We've got this pile of white pumpkins with a little bit of an orange pumpkin just peeking out. And then over here on the right, we've got Jamie's very quirky sense of humor coming out again in a picture that's called Mischief Night from 1986, where this pumpkin seems to be coming alive and wreaking havoc here. So we've covered a lot, but I am going to end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments anybody has about the Wyeth family of artists. I'll just start looking at the chats here. Sorry about the audio for tonight. Let's see here. What do you think that NC was trying to say with the vision of the Native American in the cloud of the Lobstermen? I had missed that, Jane. We might have to go back to that. Let's see. The vision of the Native American. Oh, I can sort of see what you're saying here.
Jane, we've lost the screen share. Sorry, everyone. I think maybe we lost Jane there. Hang on just a second. This has never happened before, to me at least. Let's see if Jane can join back in. Oh, here we go. Jane, we lost you for a minute.
Really interesting comment that that was made before about perhaps seeing a Native American up here in the sky. I hadn't run into any writing about that before, so that's really interesting to me. I hadn't noticed it, but I appreciate you sharing that. Let's see. Now I'm going to have to explore that a little bit more. I think I'd lost some of the questions in the chat from before. I apologize. I see Amy's question. How is Jamie's work classified? Realism it seems that there is expressionistic elements to his work, and his pumpkin painting appears surreal. Yeah, there are some of his paintings that certainly border on the surreal, but I think generally speaking, all of these artists are considered realist artists, for better or for worse. Certainly with Andrew Wyeth's work, that was sort of to his detriment. He was considered kind of he was considered kind of the best and the worst of American artists, because he continued to work in a realist style, even during a time where non-objective art and abstract art sort of reigned supreme. But Jamie sort of continues that thread. He sort of carries the family mantle in that way, but in a very playful way, which I always think is in part, the product of privilege too, because he's kind of born with a silver spoon in his mouth when it comes to entering the art world. So he can be playful, and he can sort of experiment perhaps in other elements, but for the most part, his work is considered realism. That's a great question, Amy.
Jane, there's a question from Catherine. Are there diaries or memoirs from the Wyeth family members?
That's a really good question. Offhand, I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that. Because of limited time in terms of preparing for this program, I look at a number of different resources, but I did not come across diaries like that. There's a lot out there in terms of what they said, what they thought about their work, and what they thought about each other. So Jean's comment here, Chad's Ford is an amazing resource. There's the Brandywine River Museum, which has so many examples of the Wyeth's work. It's really like the hub for the family through these 3 generations, and that's really the place where their story is told. That's probably the best resource.
There's a question from Jane. Where's the collection of the Helga paintings?
Where's the collection of the Helga paintings? That was, they were all sold to this one man, which made it seem like he was a private collector, but he was actually a printer. So he was essentially buying the rights to print these works of art. I forget his name offhand, but because it was so sensationalized at the time, the Helga paintings were all actually exhibited at the National Gallery of Art shortly after they were unveiled. And that was the first time the National Gallery of Art had ever exhibited work by a living American artist. So I'm not sure where they all live today, but they were all purchased by this one man, essentially to win the reproduction rights to them.
There was a question from Liza. Hang on. I'm scrolling through. Here we go. I think this is about N.C. Wyeth. Weren't these paintings commissioned by the government during the Depression? A lot of public buildings have other artists who painted murals typical of the time.
Yes, I'm not sure if he was like a WPA artist who was commissioned by the government during the Depression, because he was so successful. He had, I mean, he was the ultimate example of a very successful artist. And I should mention, well, I mentioned at the beginning of the program that I was always a little bit more familiar with Norman Rockwell than with N.C. Wyeth. And I was always kind of perplexed why people would always ask me, did Norman Rockwell not like being called an illustrator? And I thought, where's this question coming from? And it's coming from the fact that people are familiar with N.C. Wyeth and the fact that he really didn't want to be an illustrator. So despite that, it paid the bills for decades for him. And it paid the bills very, very well. So I'm not sure he would have been one of these artists seeking out opportunities through the WPA, but that's not to say that it didn't happen. My hunch is that it probably didn't have to happen. And Francis, thank you for adding that there are some of the Helga paintings at the Farnsworth. My goal is to get there within the next month. Oh, I can only imagine how great that collection is.
Dane, could you talk for maybe just a minute or two about some of the extended family, like Don McCoy, for example?
Sally, I will be honest, and I don't know much about the extended family. Is there a reason why you asked about Don McCoy?
He was a brother-in-law, right?
I think so.
Andrew's brother-in-law.
Yeah.
It's just my family has some of his work.
Oh, that's so cool.
That we treasure.
Do you want to share your screen right now, Sally? You want to share?
I don't have it on screen. It's in my mother's house.
Next time.
But there are. I know you can see them at the Brandywine.
Very cool.
All right. Any other questions? I think this is probably a good time to say goodnight. Thank you so much, Dane, and we hope to have you back soon. It's always a pleasure. And good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.
My pleasure.